welcome to this podcast produced by the Institute for European Environmental Policy. As a non-profit organization, IEEP informs and engages with policymakers at the EU and national levels through scientific research on how EU policy can deliver for the climate, nature, and people. My name is Juliette Pagnon. I'm a policy analyst working on agricultural and food policies. Today, we are going to talk about the land use, food, and farming system transition. It's a key part of the wider transition we need to meet our climate goals. Science is clear that without a transformation of the way we produce and consume our food, we will not be able to meet our climate and biodiversity goals. Within the European Union, policy on food and farming is dominated by the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP for short. Alongside the CAP, the current EU Commission adopted a farm-to-fork strategy to encourage the transition towards sustainable food systems. However, there has been a lot of criticism from experts and civil society of the lack of join-up between the objective of this strategy and the support paid to farmers in the CAP. Therefore, it is time to fundamentally rethink EU policy in this area. Since we have the EU election next year, leading to a new Commission and European Parliament, now is a good time to think about the needs for policy reform in the next 5 years. Among other things, this will include the decision on the next EU budget from 2028 to 2035 and how the hundreds of billions available will be spent. So we decided to focus today's discussion on what the priorities should be for the food and land use transition. What are the key challenges and how can EU policy help to address this, and what this means for the post-election policy framework. Joining today the discussion are Aurélie Catallo and Artur Metzge. Aurélie works at the French think tank IEEP, where she is director of the Agricultural and Food Policies program in France. She contributes to the intervention strategy for the production and transformation of the French food system with different stakeholders. Before joining IEEP, Aurélie set up and coordinated a French network associating agricultural and citizen organizations and working on the reform of agricultural and food policies, and in particular on the CAP. Artur is a fellow at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. He is also a member of the board of Germanwatch and the supervisory board of Agora Energiewende, and a member of the Sustainability Advisory Council of Novo Nordisk. Until 2021, he was director at the European Commission, responsible for climate neutrality strategy, governance, and regulating non-ETS sectors. He also served on the European Environmental Agency and the European Fund Strategic Investment Boards. Until 2015, he was the EU lead negotiator, co-chair of the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, and member of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change Bureau. Welcome, Aurélie. Welcome, Artur. Thank you very much for joining us for this critical topic and providing your expertise. We see that extreme climate events, such as droughts and floods, are increasing and severely affecting several sectors, especially agricultural production. Artur, what changes need to happen to agri-food system in the next decade to address climate as well as other sustainability challenges?
Thank you, Juliette, for that question. I think that the EU's agri-food system needs to provide healthy food, feed, biomaterials, and feedstock in the coming decades. And this has to be seen, therefore, in the wider context of land use in the European Union. In terms of climate, biodiversity, and water, firstly, the EU's land use system needs to be rapidly adapting to the adverse effects of climate change. In this respect, the next years, with a rising El Niño effect, might be particularly challenging. This will require serious investments, for instance, into water conservation, highly efficient water management technologies, reforestation with adapted tree species, and new cropping patterns that are more tolerant to droughts and water stress. Secondly, by 2030, the carbon footprint of the land use system along the entire value chain needs to be reduced, something we are already seeing happening for a number of years in the energy and also in the industrial sectors. One prime opportunity in the land sector is progressively phasing down emissions from cultivated peatlands and wetlands. That's a real hotspot in Europe. Thirdly, the capacity of the land and its vegetation to store carbon needs to be enhanced. For the first time, the EU has set a clear objective for the year 2030, removing 310 million tons of CO2, which is about 15% more compared to previous years. This will also require rethinking how to get it to an optimal use of biomass in the EU. Today, its use for energy purpose is being subsidized, while the value of biomass as a carbon store is not valued at all. All in all, by 2035 at the latest, the EU's land use sector will have to be climate neutral. Net zero means that as of 2035, all remaining agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from intensive livestock production and fertilizer use, will at least have to be balanced with removals. In parallel, by 2030, the EU will have to reverse current trends and be on track to restore biodiversity, to improve water use efficiency and water and air quality. On the latter, again, a few areas with highly intensive livestock production in Europe are particularly hotspots. No doubt, the required transformation cannot be done overnight. It will require steady investments over the next 2 decades. The earlier this is being started, the better. The current Common Agriculture Policy, with its new strategic plans and the eco schemes, plus the COVID recovery program, already provide opportunities in this respect. I'm confident that producing healthy food, feed, biomaterials, and feedstock, while addressing the sustainability challenges, together can be turned into a new business model that will be attractive for future generations of farmers and foresters. I fear that this will be far from an easy ride. An awful amount of convincing will have to be done. Today, many European farmers feel straitjacketed, bullied, and harassed, and are taking their tractors to the streets. However, I have the impression that the majority of farmers and foresters, as well as large parts of the food industry in Europe, recognize the challenges and want to participate actively in finding the right solutions.
Thank you, Artur. Aurélie, moving from the EU-wide level, we would like to hear a national perspective. France is one of the biggest EU countries in terms of agriculture. It occupies half of the territory, and it is the second most important sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Can you also reflect on the main changes that need to occur in France in the coming decades?
Sure. The main challenge for France's agri-food will simply be to be able to produce enough food while conditions will be much more challenging than today because of water shortage, climate change, soil degradation, etc. Today, France is the last EU country to be net exporter in calories. Hopefully, by 2030, France could keep a good level of food autonomy. Such an objective will, however, not be that easy because of both the environmental and socio-economic conditions. Let's start with environmental issues. France has to drastically improve the impact of agriculture on biodiversity. We were supposed to reach 15% of organic farming by 2022. We're a bit below, around 10% in 2022, and the organic sector is currently facing a crisis. We also have a national target of minus 50% on pesticides by 2025, which seems very difficult to reach. We also have to maintain permanent grasslands and to redevelop agri-environmental features such as hedges. France must also face climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Climate change already has and will keep having massive consequences for French agriculture, including for access to water. Besides, agriculture is expected to reduce its GHG emissions by 19% by 2030, while increasing its carbon storage capacity in the soil. Finally, other sectors also count on the agricultural biomass for their own decarbonization. While those environmental challenges are already huge for the farming sector, one should not neglect the socio-economic conditions that are needed for them to be taken up by farmers. We need to ensure that farms that are engaging in the agroecological transition are actually economically viable. We must create market conditions in which going green is profitable for a very large share of farms. Otherwise, the transition is simply not going to happen. We also have to pay attention to generation renewal amongst farmers, because the transition is also not going to happen with few old farmers.
Thank you. My next question is for you, Artur. The next European Commission should publish its proposal for the next EU budget in July 2025. What would your advice be to the next Commission and Parliament when designing these budgets in terms of funding for sustainable land management? And has the integration approach of the climate spendings into other funds, such as the CAP, worked?
There are three pieces of advice that spring to my mind. Firstly, let's be frank with each other and let's learn from past experiences with the implementation of the Common Agriculture Policy. The European Court of Auditors has criticized the CAP for not delivering on its objectives, neither on climate, biodiversity, and water, nor on the social issues. On the latter, the vast part of direct CAP payments has gone and is still going to relatively few large commercial farms that, if at all, do not need that much support. At the same time, support for smaller, more labor-intensive family farms has been inadequate to keep them on the land. The latest CAP until 2027 has been rather timid and experimental, with a rather limited amount of funding that is being redirected to eco schemes. In principle, this could provide more CAP finance dedicated to climate change, to biodiversity, and to other environmental challenges based on actual performance. Time will tell in how far member states will have made good use of these latest features of CAP support. Secondly, and I wholeheartedly agree with Aurélie on this, let's get prices right. The economics need to work for the farmers. But as the Court of Auditors pointed out, incentives to address climate change or biodiversity under the Common Agriculture Policy were poorly designed and were meager compared to the scale of the problem. Hence, understandably, their effectiveness was very limited. More generally, there is a lack of coherent set of price incentives across different uses of land. Without proper pricing, I cannot see how it will work. Just look at the ongoing energy transition in Europe. Without a price on carbon, without targeted support for renewable energy, this transition would have been unthinkable. At a carbon price of 80, 90 euros per ton of CO2, continuing with polluting fossil fuels is no longer economically viable. A price on carbon would make less polluting agricultural and forestry activities and carbon removals economically attractive, and thereby reward farmers and foresters. At the same time, it would spur investment into research to look for better agricultural practices and new technologies. Furthermore, like under the current emissions trading system, the revenues of such a system, which could amount to several tens of billions of euro per year, should be recycled, providing the land use sector with significant new resources for innovation and investment. These should be additional to the CAP. It is encouraging that these options are being discussed more openly in the run-up to the next elections of the European Parliament. And thirdly, I would ask the new members of Parliament and the new Commission to be really courageous and also start tackling the demand side issues. I think the next MEPs and the next Commission will have to have a very hard look at the role of consumers. Moving Europeans to a healthy diet will not only significantly ease the pressure on land, climate, biodiversity, and water, but it will also come with significant personal health benefits. Current trends in the EU on obesity and related diseases like diabetes 2 are totally unsustainable. Already in 2016, more than 20% of adults in Europe were obese. This share keeps on rising steadily. If policy lets current trends continue untouched, over time, immense costs for society will be quietly piling up for Europe's health systems. I think these would be my 3 pieces of advice. Be bold, be courageous.
Aurélie, coming back to you. What should be the main priorities for the spending? And where do the fund need to focus to address the challenges that you outlined before?
For sure, the spending for the agricultural sector should help them reach the various environmental challenges that we have been listed a few minutes ago. Some people will argue that this should be done via the common agricultural policy because it seems much easier to green the CAP than to create a brand new fund. Other people would argue that we have failed to green the CAP since at least 2015 and that it is a hopeless case, so that we should better create a new green fund. No matter which solution is implemented, in both cases, we need accountability mechanisms to ensure that the greening of the budget is a kept promise. Accountability mechanisms would mean that member states would not be sure to get 100% of their allocated budget unless they have proven to have spent it with a clear greening purpose. In other words, it would mean to have a real possibility of sanctions or penalties towards member states. And as one may imagine, such a mechanism will not be easy to negotiate because member states are the leading power when designing the so-called EU Multiannual Financial Framework. So we would need member states to agree on a system that A, is not at their financial interest in the short term, and B, is weakening a bit their budgetary sovereignty. Maybe the negotiations would be a bit easier if the EU budget was less dependent on the member states' money. That is to say, if the EU had more its own financial resources.
Thank you both. This has been a great discussion. It will feed into the expert vision IEEP is currently building for the next EU budget regarding the food and land use transition. Thanks again, Aurélie and Artur, for your insights, and thank you all for listening. Goodbye.